Welcome to an episode of Diverse Dialogues, where we delve into thought-provoking topics with leading experts. I'm your host, Mokong Lee, and today we have the privilege of speaking with Professor Reginald Oh, a distinguished scholar and law professor who specializes in distributive justice. Today, we will be examining the intersection of race in the education. His extensive publications record includes works like Interracial Marriage in the Shadows of Jim Crow and Regulating White Desires. Currently at Cleveland Marshall, he imparts knowledge on constitutional law, civil procedure, and legal issues in education, showcasing a commitment to fostering understanding in these critical areas of law. Professor O, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Let's dive right in. Affirmative action has been a hotly debated topic, particularly in higher education. Professor O, could you share main arguments regarding why affirmative action and why it often appears as a race war, particularly between Asians and other minority groups?
Okay, so typically I have a slightly different take on the main purpose of affirmative action than how it's typically understood. So one of the central arguments is about diversity, right? That affirmative action is about promoting student body diversity, which racial diversity is one component. And that's the basic frame of the discourse, and that's the goal. And that's partly correct. What I think might be a more useful way to think about it, that the main purpose of affirmative action in higher education is racial integration. Okay, so when I use the term racial integration, I'm going back all the way to Brown versus Board of Education, the case in 1954 in which the Supreme Court struck down racial segregation in public schools. And in striking down racial segregation in this elementary and secondary school education level, the court required schools to integrate, right? Have students of different races go to school together. That is exactly what affirmative action is aiming to do. That's the main purpose, is to integrate institutions of higher education, especially elite institutions, to make sure they're not racially exclusive or racially basically there's segregation in higher education. And I think it's important to think of it that way because there is a through line with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 to affirmative action in 2023. The same issues that underlie the reason why Brown had to be decided, racial segregation, is still prevalent today, right? Both in the elementary and secondary school level and in higher education. And it's really about the affirmative action is a commitment to creating a racially integrated society, right? Not just racially integrated higher educational institutions. It's really about racially integrating society. That's what Brown was about. That it was about breaking down a whole society, right, based on separation of the races. And so ultimately, the affirmative action decision in Harvard, SSFA versus Harvard last summer, in holding that affirmative action violates equal protection, in my view, actually goes against the core principles of Brown versus Board of Education. It's actually challenging Brown versus Board of Education and its racial integration mandate. I don't know how, I mean, literally the affirmative action in higher education and integration in elementary and secondary education, it's really the same process, making sure people of all races go to school together.
I concur with your thought on that. Just pivoting, but I read a passage in the book by Ibram Kendi. He wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist, and then he that racism or discrimination in the face of inequity is racism, right? But discrimination to defeat inequity is not racist act. Can you elaborate upon that?
Yeah, I probably think of it slightly differently than he does, but more or less I agree with his basic sentiment that discrimination, treating people differently on the basis of race, whether it's constitutionally problematic, morally wrong, can turn on what's the purpose of that discrimination. So and this is where discrimination and segregation are two different things. So you can discriminate, treat people differently on the basis of race, to segregate people to separate people. That's Jim Crow segregation. And you forced students to go to different schools on the basis of race. That was discrimination to promote segregation. That's what Brown said was unconstitutional, okay, in 1954. However, Brown, right, once Brown held school segregation was unconstitutional, segregation was illegal, okay? So, but the schools did not automatically become integrated, right? All Brown did in 1954 was to say the existing segregation of schools unconstitutional. The remedy, what's the next step, right? Once you find segregation is unconstitutional, well, you need to desegregate the schools, integrate the schools. And that did not occur right away after Brown was decided in 54 because of massive resistance to integration in the South. Integration did not start to take place until 1968, when the court in a case called Green versus New Kent County did what? Ordered essentially affirmative action, required schools, basically said district courts have the power to require schools to integrate students on the basis of race. In other words, discriminate on the basis of race to bring students together. To say we need schools can no longer be segregated in order to integrate the schools, we have to take into consideration race to make sure the schools are racially diverse, racially integrated. So that was discrimination to further integration. Okay, does that make sense? And so, and that's consistent with Brown. Brown said that is not only possible, permitted under the 14th Amendment, it was required by the 14th Amendment to achieve integration. And so that's what Kendi's talking about, that depending on what the purpose is, what the consequences are of the discrimination, that can help us understand whether there's a problem with that discrimination or not. Mm-hmm.
So with the SFFA decision, what are alternative solutions? Or do you think that the alternative solutions that they propose, such as socioeconomic status, the geographical location, and financial rankings, or do you think that those will fulfill the intended purpose of the
Well, before I get to that, I want to talk about the Asian American angle, because I want to definitely bring that up. But what about Asian Americans, right? What about Asian Americans who are claiming discrimination and being basically discriminated against, having a higher standard imposed on Asian Americans, making it harder to get into Harvard? Is that discrimination problematic or not? Is that unconstitutional or not? Here's the thing. You got to really be clear about what discrimination you are concerned about with respect to Asian Americans. Okay, there's a kind of discrimination that is not that, in my view, not that problematic constitutionally, morally, but there's another kind of discrimination that Asian Americans did experience, did suffer, that was a problem, that was invidious, wrongful discrimination by Harvard. And I'm sure you might be aware of this, right? The central claim that the Asian American plaintiffs made, one of the central claims against Harvard, was that Harvard intentionally discriminated against Asian American students and held them to a higher standard compared to white students. And how did they do that? Through the personal rating. What they did the study showing there was bias with respect to the personal rating for Asian Americans, right? Are you familiar with the personal rating? So just to explain, under Harvard admissions, there are various categories that Harvard considers applicants, academic qualifications, extracurriculars, athletic participation, and then something called the personal rating. And the personal rating essentially is an assessment of a student's character. Does the student have the requisite character, strong character, to be a Harvard student? And under this criteria, it's one of the most important criteria that you have to score extremely well on if you're going to get into Harvard. You don't score, you get a score from 1 through 6, 1 being the highest. You don't get a 1 or 2, you're not going to get in. Okay. And what the study found was that Asian Americans were consistently ranked lower on the personal rating than any other racial group: whites, African Americans, Latinos. And that was the one of the main reasons that Asian Americans got rejected at a higher rate compared to white students. Okay. That kind of discrimination. And why did Asian Americans get dinged on the personal rating? Basically, the admissions officers were saying Asian Americans, they're nondescript, they're bland, they don't stand out. And that kind of reinforces stereotypes, racial stereotypes about Asian Americans. That kind of discrimination is clearly wrong, unconstitutional, violating equal protection, and that should have been remedied. Okay. And so that kind of discrimination is problematic. Absolutely. The other kind of discrimination, which is giving race as a plus factor for other racial groups, have nothing to do with stereotypes about Asian Americans. Okay, so those are two separate claims. Does giving race as a plus factor for underrepresented racial groups, is that fair or unfair discrimination? And then the second other kind of discrimination we're talking about, the one I'm talking about that's way more problematic, is, can Harvard discriminate against Asian American students using bias and stereotypes about Asian Americans being boring, uncharismatic, nondescript, all they want, they're just, social geeks, whatever, can they use that to discriminate and deny admissions to Asian American students? So those are two separate claims. One claim, that the claim about discrimination based on stereotypes on the personal rating, yeah, that's unconstitutional, and that should have been held unconstitutional. So yes, that's a problem. Here's the thing: if you read the opinion in Harvard, the opinion that Chief Justice John Roberts wrote, you ask what did he do about that claim? It claimed that Harvard discriminated against Asian American students because of their biased application of the personal rating to Asian Americans. The court ignored it. Court never brought that up. That was one of the main claims at the lower court. The Supreme Court didn't even mention it. All it did was ban affirmative action, the use of race as a plus factor. And so, to me, the decision is actually pretty harmful for Asian Americans, because it didn't even address the central Asian American claim of bias and prejudice, bigotry against Asian American students based on racial stereotypes. And all it did was abolish affirmative action and say we're not going to use a plus factor. We're not going to allow a plus factor to be used for underrepresented racial groups. And so the central harm, the injury that Asian American applicants suffered, the court never addressed, ignored. And basically, you know what it means? Harvard can still do this. Harvard can continue to say we think Asian Americans as a whole just lack the character to be a Harvard student, and they can use that to continue to deny admissions to Asian American students, or at a lower rate. And so that's why the Harvard decision is actually really problematic for Asian American rights and Asian American equality.
When they use the personal ratings, or were looking at the personal ratings in order to admit or decline Asian American students or Asian students to higher ed,
right?
Is that empirical data that they were looking at, or was that anecdotal to whatever has?
No, good question. It was both. There was a empirical study conducted by a group of researchers led by a researcher at Duke University, and they found through this really comprehensive study that Asian Americans, there was a statistical, there was a clear statistically significant harm that Asian Americans suffered with respect to the personal rating. There's they called it a penalty. that you got, if you're Asian American, you had this percent chance of not getting in because you had a greater chance of scoring lower on the personal rating than another a white student, but any other students of a different race. So yeah, no, and also with you had the empirical data and the anecdotal data, statements by admissions officers, basically talking about how, oh, this is just another Asian American who wants to be a doctor, another one. That kind of dismissive comments, right? The anecdotal plus the empirical data. There's, to me, in my mind, and that's what my article was about in the Washington Monthly, there was a pretty strong case that there was a pattern of systemic bias, right, in the way the Harvard admissions officers applied the personal rating criteria to Asian Americans. And the criteria was super vague. It's just like, if you're outstanding, right, they're just told, number one, you give them a 1 if they're outstanding. You give them a 2 if they're excellent. You give them a 4. This is crazy. This is the actual term for a score of a 4, which is a really low score. Is the person bland? Bland. That's the word they use. That's just totally vague. That's just completely subjective. And these admissions officers could basically make up whatever reason to say, oh yeah, this person is bland. And that notion of being bland, not interesting, that's consistent with these stereotypes of Asian Americans, right? And so you had the data, you had the anecdotal evidence consistent with racial stereotypes of Asian Americans. I argue that's what the court should have done, right? Have held that the Harvard intentionally discriminates against Asian Americans on the personal rating. Okay, not the race as a plus factor. But the court, like I said, didn't even bring it up. And so it basically said, we're okay with it. And Harvard can keep doing it, keep using bias criteria, et cetera. And we're not gonna say anything about it. It's not gonna be a violation of equal protection.
Well, so I apologize, but we have to end the podcast. But you and I, we can speak more thoroughly afterwards.
Sure.
But thank you, Professor Oh, for sharing your insights on this complexity. It's really a fascinating discussion with a lot of intricacies in it. But to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of Diverse Dialogues. If you have any questions or topics you'd like to explore in the future episodes, feel free to reach out. Until next time, stay curious.
Thank you.